Welcome to Friday's lecture for American history since 1877. This is for Friday, February 5th, and we will pick up today where we left off on Wednesday with another look at industrial America in the final decades of the 19th century. But before we get into today's lecture, I want to remind you guys, a friendly reminder, if you will, that those of you that plan on submitting a primary source analysis practice assignment, the optional dress rehearsal, if you will, is due on Monday by 8 p.m. So you must email me a copy of your assignment by Monday, no later than 8 p.m. Central Time, in order for me to get a chance to review it and give you the necessary feedback. Remember, it's an optional assignment. It is not going to be graded, but I will give you feedback, and hopefully that points you in the right direction if you, as you go forward with the first primary source analysis assignment, which will be due on Wednesday, February 18th. If you're curious, or the assignment for Monday, or I should say the primary source analysis for this practice round, if you will, is available on Blackboard under the content section. It is the editorial from the March 1st, 1877 edition of the New York Times on the Compromise of 1877 that settled the contentious presidential election of 1876. So again, just a friendly reminder, if you're planning on submitting the optional primary source analysis practice assignment, that's due Monday by 8 p.m. Central. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's revisit industrial America and the age of industrial capitalism. We began to explore this topic in Wednesday's lecture, and we're going to continue to look at the aspects of this era that are listed on this title slide here, particularly number 2 and number 3, who benefits from an industrial economy and what social changes arise from the new economy. So without further ado, let us continue our discussion of the robber barons. If you recall, at the end of Wednesday's lecture, I introduced the concept of the robber barons and gave you an example of perhaps the most prominent of all the robber barons. That was John D. Rockefeller, the oil tycoon who created Standard Oil and became the richest man in America by the second decade of the 20th century. We're going to look at a couple of other prominent robber barons of this era. Today we will start with Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was a Scottish immigrant who started his career, professional career, as a railroad clerk in America. He becomes fascinated by steel as a product, and believes fervently that steel is going to be something that can be mass produced at a reasonable rate and sold for profit in this second half of the 19th century because of technological advancements that have made steel much cheaper to produce following the Civil War. In particular, there's a process known as the pig iron, which results in crude iron being constructed in a blast furnace, usually in a steel mill. Carnegie really begins to focus his business interests on steel and divests himself of other business interests to concentrate 100% on steel. And Carnegie's not really an expert in the technology to make steel. He hadn't risen from the ranks of the laborers to a management position, but he was a businessman who understood how steel could be produced and really how it could be marketed and sold during this time period. So he hires experts to help him run the company and produce the steel, and he focuses quite a bit on efficiency and trying to build steel as quickly as possible in the largest quantities as possible, and is always looking for something that will make his company more organized and more efficient and running smoother. Like Rockefeller and many of the other corporate tycoons of this era, Carnegie practiced the concept of vertical integration, which we talked about a little bit on Wednesday, and that's basically owning every aspect of production within your industry. When you, as the head of the business, go out and purchase all means of production, so you don't have to depend on suppliers, you can produce everything from start to finish yourself and can market it and sell it yourself, then you bring in more revenue, and which in turn also results in higher profits. You can see a picture of Carnegie in the upper left-hand corner, or I should say upper right-hand corner of this slide. One of the other primary robber barons of this time period, John Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan. Morgan, unlike his counterparts in steel, Andrew Carnegie, and oil, John D. Rockefeller, Morgan was born into a wealthy family. He was born into a banking family, grew up in a wealthy family, whereas Carnegie and Rockefeller were self-made men. Morgan used his family wealth and kind of got into the family business of banking, and he realized that he could make a lot of money as an investment banker and expand his wealth. He also realized that railroads were going to be a key component of the industrial economy. We've talked at length about the significance of railroads throughout the course thus far. We talked about how they were essential in westward expansion and the migration of both individuals and products and business into the Midwest and the West from the East a few weeks ago, and we discussed railroads in their role in industrial America in Wednesday's lecture. Morgan picks up on this too as this is happening, and he uses his company to acquire railroad companies and consolidate his interests in the railroads, consolidates them into corporate trusts, and he becomes an extraordinarily wealthy individual because of the corporations he owns, primarily railroads. As the century draws closer to the turn of the 20th century, by the 1890s, Morgan owned and controlled about 1/6 of America's railroads across the country. This provides him tremendous wealth, and he uses that wealth in at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1901, he buys out Andrew Carnegie's steel business from Carnegie, buys it for nearly $500 million. Carnegie himself wound up with about $300 million out of that sale, making him wealthy beyond imagination. And as a result of the acquisition of Carnegie's steel business, Morgan forms the U.S. Steel Corporation, which becomes America's very first billion-dollar corporation in the early part of the 20th century. So two very famous and significant robber barons, along with Rockefeller, who we discussed in Wednesday's lecture, Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan, the banker, if you're familiar with Chase Bank, that's part of the company J.P. Morgan Chase. That's basically Morgan's company, still alive today after all these years, and still one of the larger and more significant national banks in the United States. So we've discussed the robber barons and the industries in which they dominated and their overall philosophy of buying out competitors, horizontal or integration, which all three of the robber barons did, as well as the vertical integration that Rockefeller and Carnegie participated in terms of buying all means of production for their respective products and cutting out the middlemen. But the question becomes, how did these men and their counterparts in other industries produce so much product that they could amass these great fortunes and build these companies to such large capacities? And there are a couple of factors for that, a lot of it has to do with population, both domestically and internationally. So we'll start domestically first. After the Civil War ended, there was a tremendous influx of population into cities in America, as tens of thousands of Americans moved from farms and rural communities into urban areas and cities. Not only the older cities in the Northeast, such as New York City and Boston and Philadelphia, but also through the railroad, the proliferation of railroads, they moved to the Midwest in cities like Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas City, and further west as the century progressed. And in that area, sort of in between the Midwest and the Northeast, with places such as Cleveland and Pittsburgh and cities of that nature gaining a tremendous amount of population. There's a lot of people leaving agricultural communities and agricultural jobs in favor of city life, cities, and the jobs available in cities, which largely were industrial jobs. It results in a national shift of the American economy from a predominantly agricultural economy, which existed in America through the first half of the 19th century and into the Civil War era, to a predominantly industrial economy, which became the norm at the close in the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th century. In addition to rural Americans moving to cities and urban areas in droves, there was a wave of immigrants who moved to America during the 1870s and 1880s. Many of these immigrants came over to the U.S. from industrialized nations in Europe. The Industrial Revolution in Europe took place decades before it took place in America in the late 18th century and early 19th century. So many of these immigrants that came over to the U.S. during this time already had the skills and the skill set in place to work effectively in industrial jobs. So as a result, the combination of both immigrants from industrialized nations as well as newly relocated Americans from the rural communities produces an extraordinarily large labor pool for companies to utilize in order to fill positions, to take on major projects in terms of producing their products and in terms of expanding. It's the conditions were ripe with such a massive workforce that either already possessed the qualities for this type of work or could easily be trained by managers to perform this type of work. In addition to the population influx into cities and urban areas, the corporations and the men who ran those corporations benefited a great deal from government assistance. The federal government became extremely pro-business with policies that really sort of began in the 1860s during Lincoln's presidency. Lincoln was in favor of railroad expansion, and of course much of that occurred in the 1870s and 1880s after Lincoln's death, but during the administrations of other Republican presidents and when the Republicans controlled Congress for the most part during this time period. And so what exactly were the policies that were so business friendly that occurred during this time frame? A good chunk of it had to do with the railroad industry, in which the government provided the public land to railroad companies so that they could build rail lines in order to enhance distribution networks, create new distribution networks, and enhance existing means of distribution for their businesses. In addition to that, the federal government also maintained a fairly high protective tariff, which ensured that American companies could remain competitive with their foreign counterparts with regard to selling their products in the U.S. The foreign companies, in order to import their products to America, had to pay the protective tariff to do that, and not very many were willing to pay that tariff, and as a result, American companies were able to thrive. And also, the corporate tax rate was reduced during this era as well, and the government's hope and intention by giving tax breaks to corporations was that the companies would reinvest that savings into their businesses and expand their businesses, create jobs. And that's one of the things that's still sort of a staple of Republican Party politics in modern America throughout the 20th century and even today. The idea that if you give large corporations tax cuts, that they will invest the savings into their businesses and create new jobs and give raises and higher salaries to existing employees, and build new locations, new distribution centers, new corporate headquarters, things of that nature, regional headquarters. All of that is still a bedrock principle of the Republican Party today. You can see the origins of it in the 19th century Republican Party. It's in fact one of the few examples of 19th century Republican Party politics that remains the same, or I shouldn't say the same, but remains largely unchanged in 20th and now 21st century Republican politics. The idea of corporate tax cuts for job creation and business expansion in a nutshell. So when we talk about the expansion of the American economy during this era, we talk about the benefits that corporations enjoyed with an expanded labor force, with friendly government policies that protected their business interests, and with technological advancements that enabled them to produce larger quantities of their product at quicker speeds, and oftentimes at cheaper rate. And how does that affect consumers? How does that affect the sales portion of the American economy? And with all of this increase in production and the new, more extensive distribution network through the railroads, companies are able to sell their products into new markets that previously were unavailable to them because of transportation and distribution difficulties. And these new markets have plenty of new consumers who are eager to get their hands on products that perhaps they had no means to acquire in previous decades before this. So how does that exactly manifest itself? Well, if you look domestically, railroads are able to give these corporations a distribution outlet to reach rural America. So instead of just relying on the urban centers where their businesses are located, corporate leaders can now reach rural communities, small town America, and sell their products and wares to the rural Americans. And a big example of this involves mail order catalogs. Aaron Montgomery Ward was a Chicago-based traveling salesman in the middle of the 19th century, and he quickly realized that he could reach more customers at a more efficient clip through the new distribution outlets available to him. So he wound up founding his own company, Montgomery Ward, and his company sold products exclusively through a mail order catalog in the 1870s. Soon after the Montgomery Ward catalog hit the market, another company, Sears and Roebuck, began to produce a mail order catalog in which they sold a more extensive array of products. So what is the end result? Individuals across rural America begin to use these new advances to their benefit by purchasing items through mail order catalogs and receiving them through the U.S. Postal Service. By the close of the 19th century, this becomes even more efficient when rural mail delivery becomes free, and that only enhances sales for Sears and Roebuck. At the turn of the 20th century, approximately 6 million Sears and Roebuck catalogs were being printed and distributed each year. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, that is the cover of a Sears and Roebuck catalog from the late 19th century. I don't know the exact year, but I believe it's from the 1890s. So rural Americans now do not have to travel great distances to urban centers in order to purchase these goods. And also, because of the distribution networks being more extensive and more efficient, as well as the workforce being larger and producing at a more rapid and efficient rate, these products become far more affordable for rural Americans, and they're able to stay within their own communities and order products from the comfort of their home. This was basically the 19th century version of online shopping, if you will, long before Amazon and other online outlets. You had the mail order catalogs. Interesting to note too, this was also a chance for African Americans in the South to purchase products from outside. In much of the South during this time frame was rural, and much of the goods that were available for purchase were in general stores in the South. General stores were the place where rural Southerners purchased their goods on a daily basis, but a lot of these stores were owned and operated by white Southerners, and many times it was difficult for African Americans in the South, black Southerners, to purchase the products from these white merchants that owned general stores due to a variety of factors, including the fact that very few of them were willing to extend credit to African American consumers at this time. So what did they do? Many of them decided to go with the resourceful route and use the Sears and Roebuck catalog or the Montgomery Ward catalog and purchase goods through the mail and bypass the general store entirely if they felt that they were going to get a hard time, or that it would be too difficult and too much trouble to go through the local option. And in many cases, as I mentioned, there were more products available, a wider selection for them to choose from with these mail order catalogs. So, with all of this economic growth in industrial America, who benefits from it? That's a question that we discussed at the beginning of today's lecture. It's also something we identified at the beginning of Wednesday's lecture. Clearly, the robber barons benefit with all of this sales revenue coming in from their businesses, and they're amassing just extraordinary levels of wealth. Unfortunately, for ordinary Americans, the robber barons and the other corporate elites at the top of companies that are not spreading the wealth around. They're not distributing the wealth across the entire workforce. So as a result, by 1890, the wealthiest 1% of Americans controlled 1/4 of the nation's assets, and the top 10% of Americans, in terms of wealth, the wealthiest 10% of Americans controlled more than 70% of America's assets. In addition to this tremendous income inequality, ordinary workers face the burden of the actual process of work. The workday itself could be unbelievably unbearable in many cases. There were no significant labor laws on the books, federal labor laws. So the idea of a 40-hour work week, an 8-hour work day, a minimum wage, income, that was not, none of those things were on the books back during this time period in the late 19th century. So as a result, these ordinary workers are laboring long hours in unforgiving conditions on a daily basis. And when I say long hours, I'm talking about workers who are working 59, 60 hours a week or more. And they're often doing it for incredibly low wages, $1 a day, $2 a day, things of that nature when it comes to salaries. And the conditions could also be very harsh. If you're working in the steel mill producing steel for Andrew Carnegie's company, and you're working a 12 to 14 hour workday at $1 a day, you're getting low income and working in an environment that is, hazardous to your health or could be hazardous to your health. I mean, there were very real dangers for workers for injury and in some cases even death in these conditions. And the extraordinary gap in wealth that I'm discussing here is very obvious across America during this time period. It's obvious to the wealthy elite. It's also obvious to the rank and file workers. And that's why this age of industrial capitalism in the late 1870s through the 1890s is often referred to as the Gilded Age, because the wealthy elite accrued so much wealth and they were able to live lives in which they were quite ostentatious in displaying that wealth in terms of spending money and enjoying the finer things and the trappings of that only the wealthiest could afford, while the rank and file worker winds up just struggling to make ends meet more often than not. So that sort of begs the question: how do the robber barons and the other men at the top of these corporations, because in this time period in American history, we're talking all of these business leaders, captains of industry are men, and they're all white men. How do they justify why they get so much wealth and their employees are living in lives of relative squalor by comparison? They do it through an academic theory. They do it through. They use the theories of Charles Darwin, the British naturalist who published On the Origins of Species, an influential book in 1859 about the theory of evolution and nature. By the 1870s, Darwin's theories have become appropriated by other scholars and public intellectuals. Chief among them was a man named Herbert Spencer. Spencer was a British sociologist and biologist who applied Darwin's theories of natural selection to society as a whole by promoting the term survival of the fittest. And as far as Spencer was concerned, the way he understood that term and the way that he presented that term to the public survival of the fittest quite simply meant that the accumulation of wealth would distinguish who the fittest men in society were at the time and who the rest of society was. That the wealthy elite were the fittest of American society and British society because of their vast sums of money. And this was a concept that not only Spencer argued, but it gathered a great deal of popularity amongst the American public, particularly amongst these wealthy elite, such as the robber barons and some of the other top businessmen of the day, as well as inventors, people like Thomas Edison and the like. And it was also promoted by prominent members of the news media, such as the influential newspaper columnist H.L. Mencken, who championed social Darwinism in the early 1900s. These people viewed labor and business as a specific form of nature, sort of a human version of the forest or the jungle, if you will, and it featured both the strong within this field, and the strong were the elite businessmen at the helm of corporations, as well as the weak, and the weak being the rank and file laborers whose work produced the mass quantities of product necessary for the corporation to thrive economically, financially. And they just accepted the idea, these men did, that an unequal playing field was simply part of the social and economic landscape. This is part of the terms of social life in America, and particularly in business life, that we're going to have a small elite class who are the fittest and a larger working class who are going to struggle to get by, and perhaps through charity and other means, the weaker class can survive. But ultimately, they use this theory of social Darwinism to justify their actions. This viewpoint was not universally accepted across American society during this time. As you can imagine, the laborers, their families, basically anybody who wasn't in this uber wealthy class of individuals, which, as I mentioned earlier, was a very, very small percentage of American society during this time. Everybody else did not take kindly to this view of the social landscape of America, and they didn't take kindly to the low wages and the poor working conditions that they had to contend with on a daily basis. Ultimately, the laborers would take action in a series of strikes during this time period, and we will discuss those strikes, some of the more prominent strikes of the 1870s and particularly the 1880s and the 1890s next week, beginning on Monday. So that will conclude today's lecture. Don't forget, just as I mentioned at the top of the lecture today, if you're planning to do the primary source analysis assignment, the optional version of it for practice and for feedback, the deadline to submit that is 8 p.m. Central Time on Monday night. That's Monday, February 8th, by 8 p.m. Just send it to me via email, and I will take a look at it and give you honest feedback, which hopefully will point you in the right direction and help you as you work on the first primary source analysis assignment, which once again is due on February 18th, and you will receive that assignment by the middle of next week. That's all again for today's lecture, and I hope you guys have an enjoyable weekend and a great Super Bowl Sunday for those of you interested in watching the game and consuming the game itself and the commercials, as well as hopefully great food.